Good afternoon, everyone. It's really, really nice to see all of you. It's been a while, and I noticed that I was the shortest tenure of a pastor in Austin. So that tells you a little bit about my ability. Anyway, it's great being back here. It was a struggle getting here on I-35. It's been almost 10 years since we lived here, and it's certainly not improved. In fact, as Mr. Neff was talking about how long it took to drive from Corpus to Austin, I suspect that it would take longer today than it did back then. It's just the way things are today. But we made it. We made it in time, and that seemed doubtful as we were about Waco, and nobody was moving on the highway, but we made it fine. Unfortunately, we have to come in and go back tonight. I've got actually a meeting tonight. It's a very interesting meeting. I'll be talking to the members in Australia tonight. So I talked to Austin today and Australia tonight. It'll be 10 o'clock our time. We have a conference call, and it'll be on Skype, of course, this evening at 10 o'clock my time, and it's 2 p.m. in the afternoon in Brisbane. So I'm looking forward to that. I was the one who I held the first service in the Church of God, a worldwide association for Australia. Sitting in our apartment in Hutto in the laundry room with my laptop. And that's where it began. So I'll be speaking to them tonight, and it's an amazing time we live in, where it's as though they're sitting right across from my desk when I talk to them this evening. So we're looking forward to that. Again, unfortunately, because of all the things that are going on with the pandemic and everything else, we're not able to have quite the celebration that I think we would have otherwise. I think you would have had a lot of things to offer if it were not for that. And we all understand that. We all look forward to this portion being over. Hopefully, over the past year, we've even learned a few things about ourselves and learned a few things about our belief, and also just learned a few things in general as we move into certainly another phase of world conditions that is indeed unprecedented. So we'll look forward or look ahead to that and hopefully put this behind us here very, very shortly. At least that's my hope and my prayer. I'm as tired of it as all of you are and as worried of it as all of you are, and look forward when we're all back together. I know, again, there are difficulties with health and other reasons why people are unable to attend now. We appreciate the webcast, and certainly I want to say hello to all of those who are on the webcast today. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. We have a lot of history in Texas and a lot of history here in Austin, although it was a very short period of time. It was rather historic for us, maybe hysterical for you, but it was historical for us. There were a lot of things going on during that very short period of time. I will mention this before getting into some other things about today, and appreciate Mr. Neal and, of course, Mr. Trabig, and mentioning a few things from the past. Of course, being in Houston for almost 20 years, I had a fair knowledge of the Austin congregation over the years. In fact, I was really surprised, of course, when I knew that Mr. Neal was showing the slides. I'm not surprised that there were not any softball team pictures in all of that. Because what I recall is that was a big part of what we all did for many years back in the day, as they would say. But this coming week, of course, is another anniversary. On Wednesday, December 23rd this year, it's 10 years ago that we incorporated in the state of Florida a new organization, Church of God, a worldwide association. That was a rather difficult period of time. I've told people have asked, well, are we going to do anything for the 10th year anniversary? And not that I'm opposed to that, but I've explained to many people, it wasn't a very happy day for me. It was actually sort of a desperation time during that period of time. But then next Sabbath, I'll make a few comments on the webcast about it. Next Sabbath will be the December 26th. Actually, it was December 25th in 2010 that we held our first service here at Austin of the Church of God, a worldwide association. So that'll be the 10th anniversary, one day removed. It'll be, again, December 26th, next Sabbath, as opposed to, of course, December 25th back in 2010. I've mentioned to people over the years that it's not terribly often that I get emotional in a message. A few times it's happened over the years, and two that I remember very clearly. One was when I announced about the death of my father to the congregation in Houston. That was very, very difficult. And then, of course, when we were here and we were beginning a new congregation, a new organization back in 2010 was a bit difficult as well. So you folks witnessed one of those moments, and again, I remember it very clearly, as I'm sure many of you do as well. So that'd be the 10th anniversary. But today we're talking about the 50th anniversary. The 50th anniversary. Anniversaries are a time for reflection, but also a marker for the future. I've actually titled my sermon today, 50 Years, Now What? Now what? What do we look forward to? What does the future hold? In 1970, Texas was also the home of some of the earlier congregations of the Radio Church of God. The first congregation of the Radio Church of God in the state of Texas began in Gladewater, or East Texas, in 1953. And was followed by Houston, Corpus Christi, San Antonio, Dallas, and then, of course, later on, Austin. Now, many of you, in fact, I don't know if there are very many of you, I'm sure some of you do, have little recollection of an organization called the Radio Church of God. That probably doesn't ring a bell to very many. In fact, may sound a little bit odd. Radio Church of God. What on earth was that? The Radio Church of God began in October of 1933. And then in 1968 changed its name to the Worldwide Church of God, which most of us are a bit more familiar with. The Radio Church of God was primarily a radio ministry when it began in 1933. Who could have thought where that radio ministry would go? It wasn't until the founding of Ambassador College later on in the 1940s that the church truly began to grow and began to expand. I recall, and some of you may as well, there was a period of time in the 1960s when every Sabbath we were announcing a whole list of new churches that had begun that next week. Every single week, new congregations starting across the United States. And it was in 1961 that for the first time the Feast of Tabernacles attendance surpassed 10,000 people. And that was after 30 years of existence. There were 10,000 people at the Feast of Tabernacles in 1961. But that didn't last very long. In 1964, there were 24,000 people in attendance. And then by 1967, there were 45,000 people keeping the feast. So from 1961 to 1967, from 10,000 to 45,000 people. And there were some large groups, especially, of course, in East Texas. In 1970, when the Austin church began, 1970, there were 71,000 people keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. And 15,000 of those were in East Texas. I was a student at Ambassador College, kept the Feast of Tabernacles there in Big Sandy. 15,000 people under a tent at that time, and later on a metal building. The attendance continued to grow and finally reached 100,000 by the end of the 1970s, and eventually grew to 150,000 people observing the Feast of Tabernacles. So that was sort of the history of the church during this period of time, leading up to, of course, in 1970, the beginning of the church here in Austin, Texas. And you saw the numbers of beginning, as my recollection is, without 100 or 150 members, we would not have a congregation in a particular city. Only when there were enough people to have that many would we normally call it or refer to it as a church. It might be a Bible study, it may be just a few members in an area, but when it reached that size, then we would establish a church. And churches every single week were beginning, especially during the summertime when students were graduating from Ambassador College and were going out into the field. But society was different back at that time as well. In the 1970s, at least in 1970, the Vietnam War was still raging, and it was a big deal. The Vietnam War was the last time that 18 and 19-year-olds were actually being drafted into the service. Over 50,000 soldiers died, American soldiers died in the Vietnam War. 4 students were shot and killed while demonstrating against the war at Kent University in 1970. In 1971, in the middle of all this, Disney World opens in Orlando, Florida. Guess what a ticket cost in 1971 when they opened? $3.50 for the full day. You know what it costs today? Our family was there back in the summer, $110 per person per day. $3.50, 1971. 1972 saw the hostage taking in Munich during the Olympics. Before it was over, 11 Israeli athletes died and 5 terrorists and 1 police officer. Fashion for some at that time became more of a protest issue. Mimeograph machines were used for making copies. You had to move the TV antenna to get better reception. The sound of keys pounding on a typewriter was heard in every office and waiting room. The majority of Americans, or many Americans, smoked without any fear of getting a disease at that time. No one wore helmets on bikes or motorcycles. The most popular family car was a station wagon with real wood trim on the side. At midnight, the TV went off, and you had to watch a test program for the rest of the night until it came back on the next day. A new home cost $26,000 in 1970. A gallon of gasoline was 36 cents. A new car cost $3,500. And a can of Coke was 5 cents. That's Coca-Cola, see. 5 cents at that time. Society, both in the U.S. and around the world, has changed dramatically since 1970. 50 years is actually 2 or 3 generations removed. My real question, though, is how has the church changed in the last 50 years? How has the church changed? Or the point maybe better made is, how have you changed? Are you a better person today, if you were around, if you're old enough to have been here 50 years ago? Are you a better Christian today than you were even yesterday, last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever time you want to pick? I remember the church of 1970. I was, as I said, a student at Ambassador College. I remember counseling for baptism. This would have been 1969, actually. And thinking when I was baptized in 1969, well, when I'm old, maybe 26 or 27, I would be perfect. Beginning at that point in time, just think, 5 or 6 years as a baptized individual with God's Holy Spirit, I will be perfect in 5 or 6 years. I realized that didn't work very well. We all have looked back on our lives and seen where we came from, where we started, and where are we today. You know, the church has changed some of its teaching since 1970. We began observing Pentecost on a Sunday instead of a Monday in 1974. For most of you, you never recall a Monday Pentecost. Monday Pentecost was a big deal because we had the whole weekend. We had services on the Sabbath. We always had a picnic on Sunday, and then we had services again on Monday. Pentecost. 1974, that changed. After extensive study, looking into the subject, it was determined that it was actually Sunday when you counted 50 days, including the first day. We always had counted excluding the first day. Including the first day comes to 50 days on a Sunday, when you count, of course, from a Sabbath. 1974, we also accepted the fact that one could be married and divorced prior to conversion without needing to dissolve their marriage. Most in the church today have no real recollection of some of those days. Our understanding of healing and the role of the medical profession and medications has changed as well since 1970. These can all be documented historically, but something that is harder to assess, though, is where were we spiritually at that time and where are we today? Where's the church today? You know, in 1970, when you spoke of being a part of the church, everybody knew you meant the worldwide Church of God. It wasn't even a question. Today, that's different. Today, when you speak of the church, you have to acknowledge the fact that there are other organizations today. Many who had their origins in the worldwide Church of God. That was not true in 1970. Let's turn to Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3 is the story, or actually 2 and 3 is the story of the messages, or the messages to the 7 churches. The church has looked upon this, and I still see it appropriately, as a laying out historically of the chronological development of the church over the years. Now, there were 7 churches, we know that. They actually existed. They actually had their own traits, their own peculiarities, I guess you could say, and those are being addressed to some degree in Revelation 2 and 3. But also the continuum of the history of the church all the way up until the return of Christ. You especially find that the last 3, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, all have end-time warnings embedded within them, indicating, of course, that there is some overlap as we come to the end of the age. But look at verse 14 of Revelation 3. I want you to focus on this as we begin this afternoon. It says, "And the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write these things, write the Amen, the faithful, the true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know your works, that you're neither cold nor hot. I wish you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. And because you say, I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked." Again, obviously, we're speaking in spiritual things. Obviously, of course, we can also be talking, I shouldn't say that, about physical things, but the spiritual aspect of being wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. "I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white garments, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, and you may see, or that you may see." In verse 19, "As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten, therefore be zealous and repent." An end-time message. Obviously, in 1970, as Mr. Neal referred to, who would have thought 50 years later that the church would be here, and that we would still be talking about, of course, the end time, which we are. While our view of prophecy has changed a bit since 1970, our understanding of the return of Jesus Christ and the events that are going to precede that have not changed. We still see that. And one of the signs as we see toward the end of time is a tendency spiritually to be weak. To be weak. Now again, this is a general statement, but you and I make up the church individually, and we have to address these issues with ourselves. How does this happen? I don't think any of you were baptized one day, and as you came out of the water, you said, I want to be the best Laodicean I can possibly be. That's my goal. I really want to do that. No one does that. You start out in this way of life, committed to God, and wanting to do everything you can to be the best Christian you can. As I said, when you think about it in terms of years, you begin to think, well, I'll be better, I'm going to do better, I'm going to do better, I will do better, I'll be better. And as I grow every single year, I will become a better person, a better Christian. But over time, those things can go by the wayside. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 2. I compare Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, which I believe was written by the Apostle Paul. I compare the book of Hebrews as the Apostle Paul writing to a group of individuals who have some of the same traits as the Laodiceans have. He writes to a group of people, Jewish Christians, who had everything going for them, who had the knowledge of the truth, were only one generation removed from Jesus Christ, and yet there was something happening to them. They became sort of enamored with some physical things, and they were not the spiritual individuals, or the individuals spiritually that they should have been. In fact, Paul warns them in Hebrews chapter 2, a very stern warning. One of the most stern warnings in Scripture, at least that Paul wrote. He says, therefore we must give, verse 1, Hebrews 2, therefore we must give the more earnest heed more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. Lest we drift away. Now keep in mind that we're talking about a group of individuals who had the truth, had the knowledge, had the background. They had a Jewish background. They had the knowledge. There was no excuse. They were inexcusable for them not to do what they had known or what they knew. But here's what he says in verse 2. For if the word, unless we drift away, verse 1, verse 2, for if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Paul writes to those who had the gift. They had God's Spirit. They were the church at that time, one generation removed from Jesus Christ. And he's warning them about what? The same message that John warns the Laodiceans about: drifting away. Drifting away. It's interesting that Paul in verse 1 uses a nautical term when he speaks of drifting away. It's a powerful message. A powerful message. It says the term, as I said, is a nautical term. It's used of something flowing or slipping past. In the Young's literal translation, it says, so we must listen very carefully to the truth that we have heard, or we may drift away from it. The greatest challenge for the church of God, as described in the book of Revelation, as also described in the book of Hebrews, is drifting away. Not losing the truth or the truth leaving, but of drifting away from the truth. Drifting implies it's something that happens over a period of time. Back in the 1970s, my first assignment in the ministry was in Atlanta, Georgia. And I met my wife, or I had met her before. We married while we were in Atlanta, so I have a lot of good memories of Atlanta. There's a place north of Atlanta, a lake called Lake Lanier. Lake Lanier was built pre-World War II. It was built by the U.S. Army Corps during that time. It's a man-made lake, but it's a very popular lake. People go for recreation, and people go for fishing. It's a good place for fishing. When we were there in the 1970s, I saved a newspaper article because it made this point very, very clearly. I want to read that story to you. It's a story of two men. It appeared in the Georgia newspaper back in the 1970s. These two men were fishing on Lake Lanier, and they drowned when their boat went over the Beaufort Dam. Beaufort Dam created, of course, Lake Lanier. Two young men were fishing above the Beaufort Dam on the Suwannee River near their hometown of Beaufort, Georgia. They were fishing on Lake Lanier, a man-made lake that was developed prior to World War II. As they were concentrating on catching fish, they were unaware that they had drifted until they were not far from the water flowing over the dam. When they realized their situation, the current near the dam had become too powerful for them to keep their boat from going over. Below the dam, the water was dashing with strong force to the river below. The lake was above flood stage, so water was being allowed to go over the dam. The two young men could not stop their boat from going over the top of the dam and falling almost 100 feet. Caught by the swirling waters under the rocks, the bodies never came to the surface. After days of relentless searching, the divers finally found one body, and then 2 or 3 days later, the other. Now, as the newspaper article goes on to say, this tragedy was easily avoidable. They knew better than to fish too close to the dam. But the drift of the boat was so gradual that they did not realize they were in danger until it was too late. This idea of drifting, this idea of just being a little bit off now and a little more off and a little more off, is truly a spiritual principle that you and I have seen as well over the last many years in the church. But it works in so many ways, this idea. A NASA engineer was asked how far off course could the space shuttle be and still arrive on the moon. You remember the landing on the moon, 1969, at least you've seen it or seen the historical documents that have shown that. It was an amazing thing how that was done. If you go back and, there have been several movies made going through some of the details of all the mathematics that went into that. But essentially you have this space shuttle that circles the Earth, and then like a slingshot is slung out into space toward the moon. When it heads toward the moon, how far off could it be and still hit the moon? So an individual gave surmise. Well, what if it's 2 degrees off? Now, again, a circle is 360 degrees. What if it's 2 degrees off target? When you sling that shuttle into space, headed toward the moon, what if it's 2 degrees off? Well, the engineer pulled out his calculator and he started punching in numbers. He said to be 2 degrees off from when you blast off, or when you actually make that loop. He says, taking into consideration the time and the distance traveled, if you're 2 degrees off, you'll miss your point of orbital entry. But not only that, you'll miss the moon by 11,121 miles. 2 degrees off. Now, I believe we would all agree that the moral standards in our country, in society, are different today than they were in 1970. I think we would all agree that you don't drift upwards, you drift downward in moral standards. And I believe that's truly happened. And if we look at some of the moral standards today compared to 1970, it wasn't until 2015 that our society, and pretty much of the world actually, accepted the concept of same-sex marriage. In fact, when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he did not agree, nor would he support it. In 2015, 7 years later, he heartily embraced it, as well as many other politicians, if not most. What happened? What happens to standards? Some of you may have heard of a book, I've referred to it a few times myself, entitled Creeping Compromise. Excuse me. It was a book written by the Seventh-day Adventists a number of years ago, called Creeping Compromise, as I said. And the book actually makes the claim that no one is willing to address the falling of moral standards in society today. And he gives 2 reasons why. He says, first is the fear of offending the large majority of church members who are living below the biblical standard themselves. So that's one reason. The second reason is fear of being labeled judgmental, legalistic, holier than thou, and lacking in Christian love if you stand up for or hold up moral values, biblical standard. Essentially, those who advocate a return to higher standards are demonized and ridiculed. It's a different society today than it was 50 years ago. Another book written by Robert Bork called Slouching Toward Gomorrah. He says, with each new evidence of deterioration in moral standards, we lament for a moment and then become accustomed to it. We lament for a moment and then we become accustomed to it. The term drifting is used to refer to someone or some entity getting away from original conviction or commitment. Again, think back over 50 years, but then think ahead to the next period of time, whatever that may be. If you study the demographics of churches in the United States, you'll find that any given year, 4,000 new churches begin in the United States. But each year, 3,500 to 4,000 churches close their doors for lack of attendance. Churches often die after only a few years, but those that survive face problems with each passing generation. One of the conclusions is that the life of a church organization is about 4 generations, each generation considered to be about 20 years, after which it is no longer recognizable. Just reflect back on our history. Depending on how you calculate the generations, if you go back to the beginning of the Radio Church of God in 1933, that's 87 years ago, we're now between the 4th and the 5th generation. But that's not the real key. The real key is for each and every one of us. How long have you been a Christian? Have you drifted, and we each have to ask ourselves that question, from your initial zeal and excitement on understanding the truth, acknowledging what God had called you for, and living a new way of life from what you did before? I appreciated Mr. Neo's comment that everybody has a story. Everybody has a story. One of the greatest privileges I've had over the years in the ministry was sitting down in living rooms and different places around this country and really around the world and having people tell me their story. from the time in the Philippines where he was an old man at the time, but when he was a young man, he was in World War II. He was actually on the Bataan Death March as a Filipino, and told his story of coming into the church and how he was on his knees because he was about to be executed by an American soldier because he was accused of being a collaborator. And he was put on his knees with a gun to his head and told that he was going to be executed because he was a collaborator with the Japanese. Only to have another American soldier come rushing in and who knew him and stop the execution from occurring. 30 years after World War II, he came into a knowledge of the truth and acknowledged for the first time at that point that his life really had meaning. His life had no purpose. He drifted after World War II. His experiences during the war, including the Bataan Death March, had forever scarred him. 30 years later, he found out why he was alive. He became a member of the church, and when I met him, he was 87 years of age, and he told me his story. He was the oldest member in that congregation. He's long since deceased. That was a number of years ago. You learned your purpose in life when God called you. Now, for some of our young people, that was not a moment in time, it was a period of time. But you came to acknowledge and understand that God had a purpose for you. That you're not just someone to wander this world and to make success or not make success. To be a great person, maybe, but if there's something missing in your life, what is greatness really? But when you came to a knowledge of the truth and you opened your Bible and you saw from the time of the beginning to the time of the book of Revelation that God had a purpose for you in life, that you're here for a reason, every single human being. That's why abortion is such a horrible blight, I should say, upon our nation. Every single one has a purpose. It's a shame if you and I, or it's obviously a shame for anyone over the years, it's been called into this way of life. And allow yourself, and I say allow yourself because we absolutely have some control, to sort of drift away from that. You don't do it one day, 1 week, or 1 month. It happens over a period of time. And when you go multiple years and decades, you can begin to see it, because then it begins to show. It is very sad. There's really a good biblical example about this and a story that I'd like to go to now. Let's go to the book of Genesis. Imagine the story of a man named Lot, who is first introduced in Genesis chapter 11. He's introduced in chapter 11, and he's a great person already. He is the nephew of Abraham, possibly the most righteous man. Of course, you get to Jesus Christ, obviously, who was God in the flesh, but of human beings that walked the earth. He's the only person that God referred to as a friend. And Lot is his nephew. And Lot has all of these great things. He's a great person already. Fast forward about 25 years later. Lot is in a cave with his 2 daughters. Incest is involved. And that's the last you hear of Lot. How did he get from where he was as the nephew of Abraham, heading to Canaan, called by God to go to Canaan, Lot with him? He's called righteous Lot at one point in his life. He does not appear in Hebrews 11. In fact, he does not appear after Genesis chapter 19. He's referred to in the book of Psalms, and Christ refers to him as well. But as far as his life, how did it happen in 25 years? The story is really laid out for us to see in the book of Genesis. Notice Genesis 11, verse 27. Genesis 11, verse 27. The genealogy is introduced. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran begot Lot. Lot is the nephew. And Lot is raised by Abram. His father evidently dies when he's pretty young. And he's raised by Abraham. In chapter 12, he's included in this departure that Abram has going to Canaan. Abram is 75 years old. This gives us the time setting. So Abram departed, verse 4, chapter 12, as the Lord had spoken to him. And Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So he takes Lot with him. They're already wealthy people. I mean, some of the other historical books that you can read, I believe Josephus makes reference to this, that Abraham or Abram at this time was like a prince in that area. He was a very wealthy person, had been very successful, which means that Lot would have been as well. Then in chapter 13, the next time we hear of Lot, there's strife between his herdsmen and Abram's herdsmen. We're not talking about a couple of herders. We're talking about a lot of people. In fact, later on, we see that there were hundreds of them. So Abram and Lot are very wealthy in the land of Canaan. They have large flocks, so much so that they have controversy. Abram, as certainly what we would expect from Abram, chapter 13, verse 7. It says there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. Verse 8, so Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I'll go to the right, or if you go to the right, then I'll go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go toward Zoar. Now, even to this day, if you visit the land of Israel today, there is a beautiful Jordan Valley. And as you look down upon the Jordan Valley, it is beautiful, green, and they grow, the majority of their crops are grown along the Jordan River. It evidently looked very similar back at this time. And so Lot said, I'll take that. And he did. Very wealthy. Of course, chapter 14, he's taken captive. And actually, Abraham has to come and rescue him and all of his people. But notice verse 12 of chapter 14. This is the story. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom. Now, wait a minute. The last time we saw Lot, where was he? Well, he was out in the fields with the herdsmen and his cattle, his sheep. All of them were there. And then he moves into the Jordan Valley. But if you look at the King James, you'll find it doesn't quite say it this way. The King James Version says he pitched his tent toward Sodom. He wasn't in the city yet. So he moves from where he was and he moves closer to Sodom. Now why? Well, again, maybe, there could have been a lot of reasons. It's a small city, I guess. A lot of things would be there, conveniences you wouldn't have, or opportunities if you lived out of way. So he moves, first of all, toward Sodom. That's actually in chapter 13, where it says he moved toward, verse 12, actually chapter 13. Abram says, verse 12, he says, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. The King James says he pitched his tent toward Sodom. Then in chapter 14, he was living in Sodom. Over a period of 25 years, all of this happened. And then, of course, you come to the infamous story in Genesis 19, where the angels show up and announce to Lot they're going to destroy the city and tell Lot to leave. Well, of course, when they first come into the city, look at Genesis 19. Genesis chapter 19, verse 1. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now, there's some sources that will say that the leaders of the city sat in the gate. These are the leading citizens of the city. So follow the progress. Over a period of 25 years, Lot leaves the highland, goes into the valley, pitches his tent toward Sodom. We now find he's living in Sodom, and then we find he's sitting at the gate of the city. Not only is he in Sodom, he's involved in Sodom. It would appear that he's one of the leading families, he's one of the leading individuals in the city. And of course, when the two angels come, he brings them to his home. You know the story that occurs there. The angels have to almost forcibly grab Lot and his wife and their 2 daughters and pull them out of the city. And of course, the story of Lot's wife looking back. It's a very interesting side story. I don't have a lot more information on it. There are a couple things that disagree. Did Lot have 2 daughters, or did he have more than 2 daughters? It refers to 2 daughters who it says never known a man, and then it refers to 2 daughters who it says were, and his son-in-laws, who would have been married, it would seem. Now, one easy explanation is that the reference to them being married is that they were going to be married. They were betrothed. They were not yet married. That's possible. Or it's also possible that Lot and his wife had more daughters who remained with their husbands in the city. That may also give an indication why Lot's wife looks back. She has maybe children there. She has maybe grandchildren there. But she looks back longingly and, of course, wants to go back. And obviously the story of the pillar of salt. And then Christ uses that story almost out of the middle of nowhere in the New Testament and says, remember Lot's wife. What was the problem with Lot? And what was the problem with his wife? Over a period of 25 years, they went from the highland all the way down to in the city, to being involved in the city, to, no doubt, compromising many of their values. And yet, at one point in time, Lot is still referred to as righteous Lot. He ends his life in ignominy, at least the last reference in Scripture, chapter 19, verse 36. This is the last thing written about Lot in the book of Genesis. It says, thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. What an ignominious journey downward that you see in Lot's life. A little at a time, over a period of time. 25 years this story plays out. And look where Lot ends up. Drifting occurs. Drifting occurs. There's a book written by Arnold Cook called Historical Drift, Must My Church Die? He writes this. He says, the second generation holds its convictions less fervently. Now, that's a very general statement. Doesn't have to be. Than the pioneers. With each succeeding generation, isolation from the world becomes more and more difficult. If you read the story of ancient Israel, it really describes Israel during the period of the Judges, where it seemed like every 100 years or so, whatever period of time, from one judge to another, the Israelites would drift away and drift into idolatry. There were 2 things that always were the nemesis of the Israelites: idolatry and breaking the Sabbath. And they would drift into that over a period of time. And then they would be brought back, and they would drift back, and they would be brought back again. That's really a lot about the story of Israel. A lot of studies today say that there's a 50% drop-off after the second generation. The third generation, it's estimated that less than 30% actually hold to the original mission and purpose of the organization. And by the time you get to the fourth generation, you see that scarcely 15% really hold the same values. Why? Why is that? No one starts out thinking that in a few years I will, walk away, or I will be different in a few years. I won't believe the same thing I do today a few years from now. And everyone anticipates, and we certainly should anticipate, pray for that, as well as work toward that our children and grandchildren continue in the faith. We want that. We pray for that. There's a very interesting prophecy in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7, about the end time. In this particular prophecy, let me back up a moment. In life, we believe that God's with us, and I agree with that, and that we're going to, quote, win. Whatever win may be, we're going to win. Well, what does Scripture say? Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7 is a prophecy of the end time. And notice in verse 21, it says, and I was watching, and the same horn, this is the little horn in the end time, this religious leader comes on the scene, and he says, and he makes war with the saints and prevails against them. In other words, everything in life isn't going to work out as you want it to work out. And over a period of years, you see some of these things. We've all been disappointed. We prayed for God to heal someone, and that person was not healed. We prayed about a situation, wanting it to work out a certain way, and it didn't work out quite that way. But notice verse 22. Until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Obviously, at the end of the day, that God is going to reward the saints. But it isn't always going to be easy. Holding on to the truth, remaining faithful to this way of life, will be a challenge for the rest of your life. And there'll be times when it won't be easy. And there'll be times when it will seem as though you're not winning. Verse 25 says at the end time that this same little horn shall persecute the saints of the Most High. If you follow the margin, if you have a New King James Bible, in verse 25, the word persecute says wear out. It's the only time in the Hebrew Scriptures that this particular word is used. It's the only time it's used. It's actually an Aramaic word. It's not a Hebrew word. And it means to wear out emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. It's not talking about physically, but mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. To wear out the saints of the Most High. There is an all-out war. There is a great desire. I've looked. You can look at a lot of things. Obviously, we look at what's happened in the world in the last year. And it's amazing how that whole process of the way things unfold and the way things are happening as to the damage that's been done. The attack upon churches in our society today is unprecedented. Where is it coming from? Who is the author of a lot of this? It's amazing. I also think about it this way. We have seen in our lifetimes the development of the greatest tool for preaching the gospel the world has ever known, and that's the internet. The greatest tool. But what's happened to the internet? The internet is dominated by three things today. Pornography. It's dominated by conspiracy theories and ideas, and politics. We're at a period of time where it actually can be true that the internet can actually affect not only elections, but can affect so much about the direction of the world today. Who's the author of some of this? Who would like more than anyone else to destroy the effectiveness of the internet? So today, this wasn't even true 10 years ago. Someone could say, well, I found it on the internet. Oh, well, maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But today, if somebody says, well, I got it off the internet, you roll your eyes. Because most likely it isn't true. So the greatest tool for preaching the gospel to the world has been denigrated to the point that it is not trustworthy. I don't believe it's just happenstance that that's occurred. But it's put us in a position where that is the primary vehicle for preaching the gospel. How do you convince people it's true when so much isn't true today? Jesus Christ talked about giving up your life. Look at Mark chapter 8. Mark 8, verse 33. Mark 8, verse 33. It says, but when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, get behind me, Satan. Peter had actually rebuked Christ. For you're not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. In verse 34. When he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of the Father with the holy angels. The idea of giving up your life, the idea of giving everything you have because of what you believe in what God called you to be a part of. Getting back to the concept of drifting, when you think of it in this term, Let me make a couple of points and then I'll bring this to an end. I really want you to think about the future. But obviously we reflect on the past in order to prepare for the future. I don't know how much longer that this will go on. 50 years is a lot more than I suspected back in 1970. But that's okay. That's okay. If you're still here today, if you're still committed and convicted of this way of life today, then that's okay. But what about the future? You know, if you think about it from the physical experience, drifting requires no effort. Just let it happen. Drifting requires no effort. You know, it's easy if you look at physical examples. If you've ever been out in the ocean and just off a beach and you get caught in, you know, this riptide, and suddenly you look up and, you know, the beach is a lot further away than it was before, and you have no idea how it happened. It happens. You know, if you do nothing, drifting occurs. Second point, you will never drift upstream. It just won't happen. You will never drift upstream. That is, you will never drift to a higher standard. It's always going to be downhill or a lower standard, and that's what society has come to today. Also, drifting is dangerous to those who are around you. Those who are around you, drifting. When people get into some aspects of doctrine, they often affect others around them. It creates, again, sort of a chain reaction and affects others from drifting. What causes drifting? Personal drifting, and there are two things, two concepts, personal drifting and church drifting, or, well, I would say church drifting. Personal drifting and church drifting. What causes personal drifting? It's not complicated. Lack of Bible study, lack of prayer, lack of church attendance, as obviously you're able to attend. Lack of enthusiasm for preaching the gospel. Lack of fasting. These are all things that cause personal drifting over a period of time. How about church drifting? Churches drift when they fail to pass on the truth to the next generation. How are we doing? Churches drift when they move away from their foundational doctrines. Paul spoke of having a form of godliness. Churches drift when they fail to train new leaders. Age catches up with everyone. Where will the new leaders come from? They're sitting in services each and every Sabbath. They're not coming from the Baptist seminary. They're not coming from the Catholic college. They're sitting in congregations around the world. It's amazing to me that 2 years ago, actually 3 years ago now, at least it's coming to 3 years. Actually, it is 3 years, when we first began an international leadership training program. It's an international leadership program. When you looked around the world and you saw the difficulties that areas are facing from around the world, with without leadership in congregation after congregation. Now again, leadership exists. I'm not suggesting it doesn't. But the ability to train individuals, knowledge of Scripture, and also who have the talent and the ability and the calling to actually teach others is rare. It's rare in our country today, but it's extremely rare outside the U.S. Is it because of a lack of training or lack of effort, or what is it? Our conclusion was that a big part of it's a lack of training and a lack of effort. These are deeply converted individuals, but training is needed. Training is needed. We began a journey around the world. We actually traveled one round around the world. In that journey around the world, we had 400 individuals attend seminars and become a part of a program. Since that time, we've had several ordinations. We've actually hired 2 or 3. We hired an individual this past week from the International Leadership Program in the Philippines. It was beginning to bear fruit. And then suddenly, everything stopped. I was sitting in the airport in Guatemala City on March the 13th, a Friday afternoon, and basically told I'd better get out of the country or I may not get out of the country as things were beginning to close rapidly behind us, and that we were going to cancel services the next day, literally around the world. There were a few places that continued to meet. They didn't have the same problems we did. but essentially canceling services, and the entire program then becomes stopped at that moment in time. It was very sad and very difficult. I knew at the time that to cancel services around the world would maybe be the easiest decision we made. To begin again and to bring everybody back together again was going to be a lot more difficult. But what happens to the training program? What happens with training individuals? If you don't train new leaders, if you're not planning for the future, then you've already planned for the past, which is to fail. Planning for the future. Churches drift when they fail to train new leaders. Churches drift because their leadership drifts. Cook says in his book, organizations don't drift, only their leaders. There's a backsliding in the pulpit before there is a backsliding in the pew. That was Cook's quote. And churches drift when there's a lack of vision. Vision without action is merely a dream. Action without vision simply passes time. Vision with action can change the world. Why do we even exist? What is our purpose? What is our calling? You know, we must ask God, and I'll bring this to a conclusion, to search our hearts and show us the way. Are we guilty of spiritual drifting? Are we drifting spiritually as a church? One could say that we are in the third generation since 1970, when the first group gathered here in the Austin area. The greatest challenge for Christians is not understanding a new truth, but holding on to the faith once delivered, as Scripture tells us, and not drifting away. From a physical perspective, you can draw certain analogies and make certain points. Number one is keep rowing. As long as you're rowing, you won't be drifting. You must keep rowing. 50 years is a long time. Some of us has been around that length of time and more. I think about my mother, who will be 91 on her birthday. She began when she was 21 years old in 1952. She has to keep rowing. We all have to keep rowing. Secondarily, you must watch out for the undercurrents. You can be rowing along, but if you get caught by an undercurrent, it can really take you down. How many people do you know over the years that have been taken down by something that seems so simple and so small? Even today, are we wasting so much energy attacking and fighting and arguing and debating over either politics or the direction of our country? How much of that effort should be put into becoming better Christians ourselves and being careful of those undercurrents that can pull us under? They can truly do that. Thirdly, expect over time you will have to go against the tide, especially of society. There's it's actually a poem of some sort that I read many years ago. I'm not sure who actually wrote it. Some sources say it was written by a monk in the 12th century. Others say it was by Aldous Huxley. Others will say it's just unknown. But here's the way it goes. When I was a young man, I wanted to change the world. I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my nation. When I found I couldn't change my nation, I began to focus on my community. When I couldn't change my community, I decided to change my family. When I couldn't change my family, I realized that the only thing I could change was myself. And by changing myself, I could impact my family. And by impacting my family, I could be a light to my community. And by being a light to my community, I could influence my nation. And by influencing my nation, I could change the world. We are to be lights in darkness. A light in a world that has gone crazy. The reaction to the pandemic around the world has become almost irrational. It is absolutely hard, if not impossible, to imagine why and how some have reacted. I'm actually taking Spanish classes twice a week with a lady who's in Guatemala. She's my teacher. And so we have 2 hours of class twice a week. And the first hour we talk about world conditions. That's all in Spanish, and we're talking and carrying on about what's happening in the world. And she tells me some of the things that are being done in Guatemala. And I say, well, why? She says, well, we don't know. You know, things that can be open and things that have to be closed. You can't go in the street without a mask, but you can go into a restaurant and you know, you don't have to wear a mask. in that particular case, at least in some areas. She told me she got on a bus for the first time this past week, since everything happened in March. The first time she'd been on a bus. And she said she was so afraid that she sat in the corner and just sort of huddled up in a corner because she was so afraid. 12 months ago, those buses were packed shoulder to shoulder with people going into the city to work. And she was afraid. I said, well, why were you so afraid? She said, well, because. I said, well, why? She said, because. And I said, well, why? She said, because. And she could never really tell me exactly why she was so afraid. It's true in many countries, and of course, even to some degree in our own country. The world has changed and the world is changing. You and I have a wonderful opportunity to be a light to a very, very dark world. We must have a strong anchor. Hope is our anchor. We must never give up hope. We must never stop being positive and encouraging about the future, because God is in the future. As a church and as individuals, we must fight against the spiritual drift that will always be there. The world will always be beckoning, just as Sodom was beckoning to Lot. Can you recall the zeal that you felt the day you were baptized? Nothing can destroy the church, but we can individually and collectively drift if we aren't careful. Laodicea doesn't happen overnight. It is the result of spiritual drifting. The world is on the edge of a transformation. The world is on the edge of a transformation. In October of this year, it was estimated that 59% of the world are active users of the internet. Active users of the internet. That's 4.6 billion people actively on the internet. Not just that it's available, these are people that are actively on the internet. If Facebook were a country, it would be the largest country in the world by far. Today there are 2.7 billion active users to Facebook. In order for the Apostle Paul to speak to 1 million people, he would need to speak to 100 people every day, 7 days a week for 30 years without a break. Today, one person on a laptop computer with an internet connection can reach 2.7 billion people in theory. And this evening, I can talk to people in Australia with a very clear connection as though they're sitting in front of my desk in a little office in McKinney, Texas. The world is on the edge of a transformation. Amazing technology. But at the same time that this amazing technology is available, as I said, the three primary things on the internet are pornography, conspiracies, and politics. Satan has turned the greatest tool ever discovered by human beings for getting out a message and turned it into something that is by virtually all individuals, it seems, less than trustworthy. What does that mean for the preaching of the gospel? You know, the verse in Hebrews 2 really says it all. Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. The truth stays put unless we drift away. Consider where we are after 50 years in Austin, collectively and individually. Are you a better Christian today? Years by themselves don't make us better Christians. Number of years in the church don't make you a better person. Nor does it make a better church. The fundamentals for growth are still the same, though. Pray, study, fast, meditate, attend church as you're able, and commit to preaching the gospel and sharing the message with the world. In the end of the story, in Revelation chapter 21, not only do we have the tree of life introduced again, chapter 22, from the Garden of Eden to the very end, the tree of life is introduced again. We're also told that there is one basic principle that God is looking for from all of us. Revelation chapter 21, verse 6. Revelation 21, verse 6. It says, and he said to me, it is done. It is done. Those are the words that we look forward to hearing. It's done. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to to him who thirsts. Now this is, of course, beyond the millennium, beyond the great white throne judgment. This is the new heaven and the new earth. It is done, he says. It is done. Verse 7, he who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. To him that overcomes. That is what we must strive for. What a great pleasure it is to be here in Austin on the day of the 50th. Now, that doesn't happen very often. We could actually be here on the day of the 50th anniversary. A lot has occurred, and a lot of names have walked through the doors of the church in the 50 years. But we look forward to the future. We look forward to being the church that God will use and work with and direct individually and collectively, that we can do his will and know that God will be with us. Depends on you and me and our willingness to depend on God. Thanks for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to see all of you, to be here. As I said, I wish we could have this huge celebration. I imagine barbecue, and I imagine all of the trappings, and I imagine all of that celebrating the 50th, and I can't even get a handshake or a hug. So anyway, but it's nice to be here and to see all of you.